A barefoot widow walked into a storm with nothing left. But when she offered herself for shelter, the rancher didn't take her like others would have. He gave her soup, fire, and silence. She came just past dusk, a figure too thin for the coat she wore, hair soaked and stringing down her neck, dress hem shredded and heavy with water. She didn't run. She didn't shiver. She just walked, like the road didn't end, like she didn't expect anything good to meet her at its end anyway. Martha Dellon, widow for 6 months, 42, with no living kin who wanted her, and fewer who remembered she existed. The carpenter's wife, they used to say. Quiet, decent, strange with children, kept to herself. She'd once embroidered church cloths and packed lunches for funerals. Now she had nothing to offer but a ring she refused to take off, and a spine that bent only when no one was looking. She walked past the mercantile, where Mrs. Granger whispered behind the frosted glass. "She's still wearing that coat," the woman murmured, though no one was listening. "The one he was buried in." Martha didn't hear her. Or she did, and didn't care. She kept walking past the shuttered storefronts, past the swinging sign of the saloon, past the church bell that hadn't rung since the Henderson boy lost his leg. She turned down the road that led to the far pasture, where the Brandt ranch stood on a knoll like it didn't owe anyone a thing. The last mile was all mud. Her shoes stuck and tore. She lost one crossing the ditch and didn't go back for it. The barn door was closed but unlocked. The animals stirred when she entered, rain gusting in behind her. She shut the door with both hands and leaned against it, breath fogging in the air, one boot and one bare foot trembling against packed dirt. A low voice came from the shadows. "Not much left in this barn but feed sacks and quiet." She didn't flinch. He stepped forward, lantern in hand, casting light upward across his face, like a lantern-lit statue. Elias Brandt, 38, tall, broad through the chest, rough hands. He wore solitude the way some men wore authority, not by choice, but by muscle memory. "I'll sleep by the far stall," she said simply. "No women in town would take me in," she added, not as a plea, but as a fact. He studied her. The rain still dripped from the hem of her skirt, leaving a slow trail across his clean barn floor. "I'm not running a boarding house," he said. "I'm not asking for one." "What are you offering?" She didn't speak right away. She looked down at her hands. The ring was still there, thin and dull. She turned it with her thumb. "Whatever you'll take," she said at last. "You can call it work, or payment, or shame. I don't care anymore." The wind howled again. He held the lantern between them, and the silence stretched until it grew heavy. "I won't touch you," he said. "I didn't ask you to." He turned, set the lantern on the feed shelf, and walked back to the house. She stayed. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Then the door creaked again. She looked up. He returned with a folded blanket, an oil lamp, and dry socks. "You can come in the house if you want," he said, not unkindly. "There's more heat in the stone than there is in this barn." She looked at the socks first, then him. "I won't be trouble." He didn't answer, just waited. She followed. The house smelled like pine ash and old coffee. The hearth was lit but low. A rocking chair stood angled toward the fire, an empty teacup beside it on a small cedar table. She went to the fire, sat down, and stretched her bare foot toward it. He knelt beside her, not looking at her directly, and helped pull the sock onto the frozen foot. Her breath caught, not from desire, not from fear, from kindness. It had been too long. He rose without comment and went to the stove. "You hungry?" She nodded. He handed her a tin bowl of leftover beans and a hunk of cornbread. She didn't speak while she ate. He didn't either. When she finished, she placed the empty bowl beside the rocking chair and curled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He watched her a moment longer, then took the cup from the cedar table, refilled it with hot water and tea leaves, and set it back without a word. The clock ticked. Rain tapped the window. The fire cracked. She dozed off sometime after midnight, curled like a child beneath her dead husband's coat. Elias watched her sleep. Then he stoked the fire one more time and went to bed, boots heavy on the stairs. By morning, the storm had passed. He came down to find the hearth swept clean, the teacup washed and dried, and his porch clear of last autumn's leaves. She stood out front with a battered broom and a square of cloth tied over her wet hair. "Thought I'd at least earn the meal," she said without looking up. "You don't have to." "I do." He didn't argue. They moved like separate gears that somehow turned together, her in silence, folding blankets and wiping sills, him outside mending fence posts and feeding stock. They said little, but when they passed in the hallway, their eyes met and didn't dart away. That was new, and it mattered. That evening, he sat on the front steps, elbows on knees. She brought him tea without asking. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Built a place with my brother. He died 2 years back. Stampede." "I'm sorry." He didn't say thank you. Just stared out at the dusk, settling over the land. "Folks don't speak your name kindly in town," he added after a while. "I know. They say you turned down charity and then asked for favors." "I turned down charity because it had strings. I asked for work. They said I was too old and too strange." His jaw tightened. "I don't think you're strange," he said. She smiled barely, but it softened her whole face. "You don't know me yet. I know you swept my porch." A silence fell between them, this one warmer. She set the teacup down beside him and stepped back inside. He stayed out long after the light went, letting her scent, wild lavender and storm-soaked earth, linger on the breeze. The next week passed in a rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud. She cooked. He brought her fabric from town. She mended his shirts. He moved her a chair by the east window. He found her standing in it one morning, eyes closed, hands to the glass as dawn bled gold across her face. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to remember how hope feels," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but he didn't forget either. When the pastor knocked on the third day, Elias stepped out first. "She's just staying warm," he said before the man could speak. "I understand, Elias," the pastor said, lips tight, but tongues wagged. "And a widow in your home unwed, the town starting to talk." Elias looked past him, out at the land, then back. "Let them. You'll be judged." Been judged before. Inside, Martha sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes on the front door. He turned to her after the preacher left. "You don't have to leave," he said. "I know. You sure you're not scared?" "I've been cold, hungry, alone, and married to a man who never once said he loved me. This is better than all of that." He watched her. She didn't blink. "Then stay," he said. She nodded, and that night, for the first time in over a year, he added an extra log to the fire. Not for the heat, but for the sound it made. A house doesn't feel alive until someone walks barefoot on its floor in the quiet. She gave the house that. She didn't come to be loved. She came not to die in the rain. But somehow, in the quiet corners of a quiet house, she gave it back its voice, and he let her. And neither of them said it, but they both knew. The storm hadn't driven her here. It had introduced them. She stayed like she belonged to no one, not as a guest, nor a burden, not with demands or apologies. She moved through Elias Brandt's house like wind through a canyon, quiet, constant, shaping without ever claiming. The days that followed blurred together in the way gentle weather does, not for lack of notice, but for how deeply it sinks into bone. Martha swept, not because she was told, but because her hands couldn't sit still. She mended curtains with thread she found in a forgotten drawer. She picked herbs growing wild beside the shed and laid them to dry near the window, where the sun touched them like memory. She polished the copper basin, folded Elias's shirts, and carried out scraps for the hound that came by each dusk to lie near the stoop. No one told her to make the house a home. She just needed something to belong to, even if it was only the rhythm of chores. Elias said little. He nodded when she passed, set plates beside hers at the table, left the kettle half-filled, so she could boil tea when she pleased. But even his silence softened over time. She caught him looking at her, not with hunger, but with something she hadn't known men could carry. Recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that asked nothing but gave room. On the 5th morning, she came in from gathering eggs to find her boots, ruined from the storm, set by the fire, cleaned and restitched with care. She touched them, sat beside them, didn't weep. That night, she baked a cornbread that filled the house with scent. When Elias entered, he paused in the doorway, hands chapped from woodwork, and said, "Smells like how it used to." She didn't ask what he meant. She just passed him a slice, still warm. They ate in silence. That was enough. The first tension came from town. Mrs. Granger from the Mercantile made a delivery Elias hadn't requested, flour, soap, coffee, and lingered on the porch with a fixed expression. "People wonder what a widow's doing alone on a man's ranch," she said, loud enough to carry through the open door. "Some say it's shameful. Others say it's planned." Martha stood in the kitchen, hands still from scrubbing a pan. Elias turned toward the woman. "She's not yours to discuss," he said simply. Mrs. Granger sniffed. "No, but she's under your roof." Elias stepped forward, eyes steady. "She swept the barn before she slept in it. She's cleaned every corner of this house, mended things I didn't notice were broken. That's more than half this town's ever done." Mrs. Granger blinked. "You should be careful. Tongues aren't kind. I've never found them useful." She left with a huff. The sound of her buggy wheels faded into the prairie wind. Elias turned back inside. Martha hadn't moved. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know." She dried the pan in silence. That evening, she left a pie on Mrs. Granger's porch. Not out of penance. Out of something harder, Grace. Days passed. Winter's breath crept along the windows. Elias brought in firewood, stacking it beside the hearth, while she knitted a scarf, with old wool unraveled from a worn blanket. "You're quiet," he said, not as criticism, but observation. She looked up. "I've said enough in life. Most of it didn't change anything." He nodded. "Still, the house sounds different. Quieter. Warmer." She smiled. Her cheeks colored just slightly. "You ever miss talk?" she asked. He poked a fire. "Only when I've got something worth saying." She watched him. The way he sat on the floor instead of the chair, back against the stone, legs stretched out like he'd forgotten they ached. His presence didn't fill the room, it steadied it. "I was told I talked too soft," she said after a pause. "My husband used to say, 'Speak up, Martha, or stay quiet.' So I stayed quiet." Elias looked at her. He was wrong. She blinked. "You say things people feel," he added. "Not all of us learn to listen until late." She stitched 3 more rows before saying, "Maybe we're both late to everything. Maybe that's the only way anything good gets here." They moved as 2 people who'd known loneliness too long to name it anymore. She began leaving little things where he'd notice. A tin of balm for his cracked hands, a clean rag folded just so, fresh coffee in the morning. He began bringing her things he thought she might use: spools of thread, a book with poems, a coat he'd found in a trunk that still smelled of cedar. He never said she should stay. She never asked if she could. But each day she remained was an answer neither had the language for. One afternoon, he came in with blood on his sleeve. A nail had split his arm open down in the pen. Martha didn't flinch. She took a basin, warm water, cloth, and his hand. "Sit," she said. He obeyed. Quietly. Her fingers were careful. Steady. She cleaned the wound, dried it, wrapped it tight with linen from her stash. When she was done, he said, "Thank you." She was still kneeling, her face near his, her breath caught in the still air. "You're not used to being tended," she said. "Neither are you." She nodded. "I didn't think I'd do this again. Not since." "Since?" She sat back. "Since before I stopped being someone's wife and started being someone's mistake." He exhaled slowly, looked down at his hand, bandaged now. Strong, but trembled just a little. "You're not a mistake." He didn't say it loudly, but it landed. She turned her face away. "If I believed that, I might stay." "Then believe it," he said. They didn't touch, but the space between them, still and taut, felt like the beginning of something sacred. The next day, Martha went to town. She wore her best shawl, pinned her hair up, and kept her eyes low. People stared. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Granger raised a brow, but said nothing as Martha paid for flour, with coins saved from selling small embroideries to neighbors. Outside, a cluster of women murmured near the post office. One of them turned and spoke just loud enough. Some women know when their time's past. Others cling like ivy to the nearest wall. Martha didn't stop, didn't flinch, but her ears burned. She walked home the long way, through the pasture. That night, Elias found her standing in the kitchen with her hand still, the bread half-made. "They said I'm clinging," she whispered. He stepped closer. "You're standing. I don't belong anywhere. You belong where you're welcome, and you're welcome here." She turned to him, eyes sharp with tears that hadn't fallen. "But if you defend me again," she said, "they'll say it's because I've betted you." "I don't care what they say." "I do." He nodded, and then he said gently, "You can move into the spare room." "I thought I already had." "You had the space, not the name." She breathed deep. "I don't need your name." "I know, but it's kind of you to offer it, without asking for something back." He smiled. "You've already given me something back." "What?" He hesitated then. "Laughter." She blinked. "I laughed this morning when you burned the bacon." She bit her lip. "You did. That was the first time in 2 years." She didn't answer. But that night, she laid her pillow in the spare room, folded her old dress, smoothed the quilt with reverent hands, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't sleep curled in defense. She slept long and deep, the kind of sleep that comes after a long walk home. A week passed. On Sunday morning, Elias found her in the barn, kneeling by the smallest lamb. It had taken sick in the night. She had it bundled in her shawl, eyes full of worry. "She's cold," Martha said. "I don't think she'll make it." Elias knelt beside her. "Some things don't, even when we try." "I know," she whispered, "but I want her to." He didn't touch her, but he sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, while the wind howled just outside the walls. The lamb died before sundown. Martha wept alone, but not unseen. Later, Elias found her in the garden, planting winter onions, with red-rimmed eyes. "They grow in the cold," she said, "even after loss." He knelt beside her, dug with his bare hands. "I never knew that," he said. "I didn't either. I just want to believe it." He looked at her, dirt on her hands, grief in her chest, and the smell of snow in the air. "You make this place feel real," he said. She didn't answer, but she kept planting, and beside her, so did he. When night fell, they shared stew in silence. Then, as if pulled by instinct, they both rose from the table and moved toward the hearth. He sat first. She followed. They didn't speak, but their silence had changed. It no longer filled the room. It wrapped around them like a blanket, and when the fire dimmed and the coals glowed soft orange, she said, almost sleepily, "I'm not used to being kept." "You're not being kept," he replied. "I'm not used to being safe." "Then stay long enough that it becomes normal." She didn't answer, but when she looked over at him, she smiled, not out of obligation, not out of thanks, but because, for the first time in her life, she believed him, and that was worth more than any name, any vow, any shelter offered by law. She stayed because she was no longer waiting to be chosen. She stayed because she'd begun to choose herself, and the house somehow knew it. The boards didn't creak so much anymore. The fire burned slower, and Elias Brant began to sleep through the night. They weren't lovers, not yet, but they were something harder to define. Two quiet lives, unfolding at the same pace. Two wounds, healing by shared space. Two strangers, learning, finally, that even the unwanted are worthy of warmth, and that maybe, just maybe, being claimed by no one is how we begin to belong to ourselves. The house changed her, not in a way anyone else could see, not in her posture or voice, not even in her clothes, but in the way she moved within its walls. She no longer stepped cautiously from room to room. She no longer flinched when Elias entered unexpectedly. Her hands, once quick to tidy or hide, now lingered on things, a quilt edge, the windowsill, the pages of the poem book he'd given her. She had begun to belong, not to Elias, not even to the house, but to the rhythm of being alive inside something that didn't ask her to shrink. She began humming while she cleaned. Soft tunes without words, memories of lullabies never sung to children she never bore. Elias noticed, though he never said a thing. He just moved through the hallways a little slower, as if not to disturb the melody. And once, when she stopped humming mid-song, he paused in the doorway and said, "Don't stop on my account." She turned, surprised, and smiled. The tune resumed. He wasn't a man of praise, not in words, but his actions sharpened around her presence. Doors fixed quicker, soup warmed sooner, wood chopped and stacked high before she could ask. He never told her he liked her cooking, but his bowl was always clean. He never complimented her embroidery, but her stitched pillow ended up beneath his head each night. Small things, but they were all she'd ever wanted. Not affection for performance, but appreciation for simply existing. The house, once a cold square of practicality, softened. Curtains she'd sewn from old muslin now fluttered at the windows. A small jar of wildflowers appeared weakly on the table, no one claiming them. A second rocking chair was dragged beside hers, facing the fire, worn smooth by quiet evenings, spent not speaking but not alone. The kitchen filled with smells, sage, cinnamon, fresh bread. She'd been told once she was a woman of too many silences. Now she filled spaces without needing to speak at all. And then came the letter, folded 3 times, sealed with wax, delivered by a boy from town with nervous fingers and shifting eyes. He left it in her hand like it burned him and turned back without a word. She didn't open it right away. Carried it in her apron pocket through the day's work, touching it only when alone. At dusk, by the fire, she opened it slowly. Elias watched from across the room, saying nothing. She read it once, then again, folded it back, held it against her chest, like something that could bruise from touch. "It's from my husband's brother," she said finally, "the one who wouldn't take me in." Elias nodded. "He says I left debt behind, that I took more than was mine, that if I don't return or pay, he'll have my name smeared through court and church." Elias didn't move. "Is it true?" She looked into the fire. "He wanted my sewing machine, claimed it as part of the house. I took it. I made things with it, sold some. Then you worked. He says I stole. And if you go back, I'll be given a cot and fed in exchange for cleaning floors I once danced across. He'll call that forgiveness." Silence stretched. "You don't owe him anything," Elias said, "but the town might agree with him." He leaned forward. "The town doesn't get to decide what you're worth." Martha didn't cry, but she folded the letter like it was something living she needed to bury. She stood, placed it in the fire, watched it blacken, curl, and vanish. "I won't leave," she said, "even if they call me thief." He rose too, slower. Then we faced them together. And from that moment, her spine seemed straighter. That week, she walked to church alone, sat in the back pew. Heads turned, whispers swelled like tidewater. No one sat near her. The preacher paused when he saw her, uncertain whether to greet or ignore. She bowed her head and stayed through every verse. When it ended, no one said a word to her. Not kindness, not cruelty, but she had walked in and walked out, whole. That was enough. At home, she found Elias waiting on the porch, 2 mugs in hand. He didn't ask how it went, just handed her tea. "I thought I'd go again next week," she said. "I'll go with you. You don't believe in much. I believe in you." She held the cup tight. "That's heavier than it sounds. I've carried heavier." He turned toward the pasture, where wind blew across the fields like hands smoothing linens. Later that week, she gathered her embroidery into bundles and walked house to house, offered her work in exchange for bread, sugar, wool. Some women turned her away. Others handed over supplies without meeting her eyes. But 2, Mrs. Alcott and Widow Jennings, accepted her services and said thank you. When she returned, her arms were full. Elias raised a brow. "I earned it," she said. He smiled. "I never doubted." Still, something in her braced for loss. She had never been allowed to keep good things. One night, the pastor knocked. Martha opened the door. He looked past her at Elias, then back at her. "I came to speak peace," he said, "and offer suggestion." She stepped aside. "You can say it plainly." He came in, but not all the way. Stood just inside the threshold. "There's concern about your arrangement," he said. "A widow and a man, sharing roof, without covenant." "We've shared nothing but silence and firewood," Elias said from his chair. "That may be. But the gossip can rot where it grows," Martha said, voice quiet. The pastor hesitated. "Still, the suggestion stands. Marriage would put things at ease." Elias looked up. "Whose ease?" "Yours. Hers. The town's." Elias rose slowly. "If it's hers you care about, ask her." The pastor looked to Martha. She folded her arms. "I've been a wife," she said, "to a man who saw me as a steward. I'd rather be a scandal in my own name than righteous in someone else's." The pastor flushed. "Very well," he said stiffly. "But you're watched." Martha held the door for him. "I know." After he left, she turned to Elias. "I'm not against the idea," she said, "but it has to come from need, not from fear." "I'd never ask from fear." She studied him. "Then don't ask yet." He nodded. "I won't." And somehow, they grew even closer after that. Spring threatened at the edge of the wind. Shoots began to rise. The house creaked less, opened more. The rooms no longer felt too large for one person, nor too narrow for two. One morning, Elias came in to find Martha standing on a stool, hanging fresh curtains. "You're gonna fall," he warned. "I used to balance on beams in our attic." She replied, "I'll be fine." He steadied the stool anyway, and when she climbed down, he held her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For giving me somewhere to put roots." "You've changed this place." "No, it changed me first." "You made it bloom. Then we both did. And neither let go right away." That evening, she lit candles in the windows. "I want this place to be warm when people pass," she said. He stood beside her. "They'll think it's a house of light." She smiled. "Let them think something good for once." But good things invite resistance. 2 days later, Widow Jennings arrived weeping. Her roof had collapsed in the storm. "I heard you taking strays," she said, half laughing, half ashamed. Martha brought her in, set her by the fire, made tea. Elias repaired the roof the next morning. And just like that, the house became more than shelter. It became haven. People came to leave things, baskets of cloth, old pans, children's shoes. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. But their silence was no longer cruel. It was reverent. One evening, a child knocked. 8 years old, muddy, lost. "Mama says you so," she said. "Can you fix my doll?" Martha knelt, took the cloth doll gently, and smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, I can." And in that moment, Elias watched her face and knew. She wasn't the same woman who arrived barefoot in a storm. She was someone who made things whole. Not just with thread, with presence, with grace, with love she never claimed aloud, but lived in everything she touched. That night, he left a letter on her pillow. No flourish, no poetry. Just, "You changed this house. You changed me. I won't ask what you don't offer. But if you ever say the word, I will stand beside you forever. No town, no preacher, just us." She found it in the morning, pressed it to her lips, and lit a fire in the hearth. A bigger one, because warmth, she'd learned, wasn't a luxury. It was a birthright. And love, quiet, earned, undeserved, was no longer something to fear. It was something to welcome. Like spring, like light, like the sound of footsteps returning each evening to a house no longer empty. The spring wind came early, warm and full of yellow dust that danced in the corners of the porch like it had waited all winter for the chance. Elias stood by the fence, sleeves rolled, arms tanned from early labor, watching calves stumble behind their mothers. The barn was repaired now, the pen stronger, the earth less cruel beneath his boots. He didn't feel different, but the house behind him had changed, and that meant he had too. Inside, Martha bent over her sewing table, hands swift, eyes soft. She was finishing the quilt she'd started the first night, she slept under his roof. A patchwork of old dresses, feed sack cotton, and strips of curtain. One square had a tiny embroidered flame, stitched in orange thread. She hadn't meant to add it, not at first. But one night, while he was mending tack, and she sat with her tea, she had simply begun. A fire, small but glowing. A quiet emblem of something neither of them named out loud. They were something now. Not man and wife in the eyes of town or church. Not declared by vows or witnessed by rings. But something gentler and harder to break. Two people who'd chosen not to leave. That afternoon, a rider came. Dust on his coat, sun in his eyes, a letter clenched in his fist like he feared it would escape. He dismounted stiffly and asked for Martha. Elias met him at the porch, gaze steady. She's inside. The rider tipped his hat. It's family business. I'm her family. The man hesitated. You're not blood. No, Elias said. But I'm who stands between her and anything she don't want. The rider shifted. It's from the court. Martha stepped out before more could be said, her hands covered in flour. She took the letter without blinking, opened it with a bread knife, and read it while the wind caught her hair. It's from my husband's brother, she murmured. He filed charges. Theft of property. Fraud of inheritance. He's called me a fugitive. Do you need to go? Elias asked. She looked at him. Not afraid. Just tired. I have nothing to prove to a man who only remembered me to shame me. The rider waited. Do you plan to respond? I just did, she said, and turned back inside. The man rode off with no satisfaction to report. That evening, Elias pulled the letter from the hearth, where she dropped it and read the ashes. I can take you out of the territory, he offered later, voice low. Start fresh. New name, new place. No one would find you. I don't want a new name, she said. I just want this one to mean something. He looked at her. It already does. That night, the fire burned bright, brighter than ever. They sat beside it, shoulder to shoulder, neither speaking. But when his hand brushed hers, and she didn't pull away, he closed his fingers gently around hers. Her hand was still. Then her thumb moved once. A circle over his knuckle. That was all. The next morning, she wore the blue shawl he'd gifted her months ago. Not because of the cold, but because it was his. Because it was hers now, too. The town met that Sunday. Unofficial, quiet. Held in the church under the guise of cleaning day. But everyone knew what it was. A gathering to discuss a woman who wouldn't leave, and the man who let her stay. She's a danger to his name, someone said. She's not even kin, said another. She's made the place better, whispered a third, an old man who remembered her pie. They debated what to do. Elias didn't go. She stood in the doorway in a simple cotton dress, hair pulled back, hands unadorned. No lipstick, no hat, just the quiet dignity of someone who'd been torn down too many times to fear splinters anymore. If you wanted me gone, she said, you should have said so when I had nowhere else to go. Now I have something to lose. They didn't interrupt her. Some looked ashamed, others indignant. I didn't come to seduce, she continued. I came to survive. And in surviving, I gave something back. To the man who opened his door. To the town that watched. Mrs. Granger muttered something sharp. Martha turned her way. If you think I've sinned, ask yourself what kindness looks like to someone with no roof. Then decide if you've ever offered it. No one spoke after that. She left the church with her head high. Elias was waiting with a wagon. She climbed in without looking back. They'll talk more now, he said. They always do. He smiled. Doesn't change the roof over our heads. That night, he brought out the bottle of whiskey he only opened on birthdays and deaths. He poured them each a finger's worth, and they drank it by the fire. Then he stood. I've lived alone long enough, he said, and I've watched enough seasons change to know what won't. She looked up at him, the firelight soft on her face. I'd like you to marry me, he said, not because they want it, not to protect you, but because every morning I wake up and you're here, it feels like I was meant to wait beside someone. She didn't answer right away. Her hand touched the hem of her dress, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. Elias, she said quietly, I don't know how to be a bride anymore." "You're not a bride," he said. "You're the woman I'd asked to build a life with. Slow. Unnamed if it must be. But not alone." Tears didn't fall, but they gathered. "Then yes," she whispered. "Whatever name it takes. I choose it." He knelt in front of her and didn't pull out a ring. He just took her hand, kissed it once, and stood. They married 2 days later in their own field, under the oak tree she'd planted flowers around. The preacher came because Elias asked him to. A few neighbors stood by with covered baskets and shy faces. No dress, no veil. Just Martha in her cotton gown, hair in a single braid, eyes clear as river glass. The vows were spoken softly. The kiss was not rushed. It was not showy. It was everything. Afterward, Martha carried in the pie she'd made and cut it herself. Elias poured cider. The fire was already burning before the guests left. That night, in their bed for the first time as husband and wife, he did not touch her with hunger. He touched her like a man afraid to break something finally whole. She touched him like a woman who had nothing to prove, only warmth to give. And when the fire crackled and the windows glowed, they fell asleep as one. No secrets, no shadows, just breath and heartbeat and the whisper of stitched linen. Weeks passed. The gossip softened. The visits grew. Children came by asking for stories. She gave them warm bread instead. Elias worked the land with more purpose than before. And the house felt lived in. It creaked less. It sighed more. One afternoon, they found a cradle left on the porch, carved from walnut. A note read, "For the home that taught the rest of us how to open our doors again." Martha ran her fingers over the smooth edge. They had no child, none expected, but the cradle stayed. A symbol, not of what was missing, but of what they'd given. Love that held, that healed, that didn't ask for praise. It was enough. And on one of the first warm nights of that full spring, Martha sat on the porch, a quilt in her lap, Elias beside her, with his hat tilted low. She looked at the stars and said, "The fire wasn't the hearth. It was us." He reached for her hand, and with the quiet certainty of men who don't need to speak to be heard, he whispered, "It always was." And so, the fire finally warmed them, not because it burned, but because it stayed.